All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're diving into a case that's, well, it's both fascinating and disturbing, frankly. The West Mesa murders.
Yeah, a real head scratcher.
You shared the Wikipedia article, and wow, talk about a rabbit hole, huh?
It is.
11 women, a shallow grave in the desert, and so many unanswered questions.
It's the kind of case that really grabs you.
It does, it really does. So for those who haven't heard of it, let's set the scene. It's 2009, Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Beautiful place, but yeah, this case.
Yeah, a woman is walking her dog in the West Mesa desert. Seems like a pretty normal day, right?
Right.
And then she stumbles across, well, a human bone just lying there out in the open.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. That discovery led investigators to, well, they found the remains of 11 women and girls,
11.
all buried together. And they had all gone missing over a period of several years.
Yeah, and the article points out they were all women, mostly Hispanic, ranging in age from, what was it, 15 to 32?
Yeah, 15 to 32. And many of them, as the article mentions, they were involved in sex work or struggling with addiction.
Which, I mean, that's a whole other layer to this, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, their lives, even before they disappeared, were often marked by hardship.
Right, you were already facing so many challenges.
Exactly, and that unfortunately makes them vulnerable, often overlooked, even dismissed by society.
It's a sad reality, and it's something we see time and time again in cases like this.
It is, it is.
Now, looking at the timeline, the women vanished between 2001 and 2005.
A pretty long span.
Yeah, and what's really eerie is that satellite images from that time, they actually show tire tracks and disturbed earth right where the bodies were found. It's like whoever did this, they planned it out, they took steps to hide what they were doing.
It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing, that's for sure. It makes you wonder, was this the work of a single person, you know, a lone wolf kind of serial killer, or something more organized, something more sinister?
Especially when you consider that theory about a possible sex trafficking ring operating through Texas.
Right, maybe using events like the New Mexico State Fair as a way to prey on vulnerable women.
It's a terrifying thought, and it adds a whole new dimension to the case.
It does. And you have to think about Albuquerque's location, its proximity to major highways and the border. It sadly makes sense as a potential hub for that kind of activity.
It's a lot to take in. And then, of course, there's this nickname the media gave to whoever was behind this, the West Mesa Bone Collector.
Chilling, isn't it?
It is. It's evocative, and it speaks to the mystery that still surrounds the case.
Because despite all the resources, the investigation leads, it's still unsolved. The Wikipedia article names a few potential suspects, but let's dive a little deeper, shall we? See who these people were and why they were on the radar.
All right, let's start with Lorenzo Montoya. Lives close to the burial site, had a history of violence against women involved in sex work. Even threatened to kill and bury his girlfriend in a way eerily similar to what happened to the victims.
And here's the thing. He was killed in 2006 by the boyfriend of a young woman he had attacked.
Wait, so he was killed while potentially in the act of violence?
Yeah, that's right. And even more chilling, the West Mesa killings seemed to stop right around the time he died.
Wow, okay. So could he have been the West Mesa Bone Collector? Case closed.
It's tempting to say that, but there are other potential suspects we need to consider. Like Fred Reynolds, a pimp who knew one of the missing women.
Okay.
And he supposedly had photos of other missing sex workers. But here's the thing, Reynolds died of natural causes in 2009.
So we've got a possibly deceased perpetrator and a deceased person of interest who might have had crucial information. This is getting complicated.
It is, and there's more. Investigators also looked into Ron Irwin, a photographer, and he frequented the Albuquerque State Fair.
Right, so another possible connection there.
Potentially. But Irwin was later cleared as a suspect. Then there's Scott Lee Kimball, convicted serial killer from Colorado. He claimed to have been investigated for the West Mesa murders, but denied any involvement.
Another dead end.
Not necessarily. We also have Joseph Blee, a convicted rapist known as, get this, the mid-school rapist.
Okay, now that one's sending shivers down my spine. What's his connection?
So he was serving time for a series of rapes in the 80s, and DNA evidence linked him to another unsolved rape case. And some circumstantial evidence points to a possible connection to the West Mesa murders as well.
Circumstantial evidence like what?
Well, they found a tree tag at the burial site, traced it back to a nursery that Blee frequented.
Huh. That's a pretty specific link. Did he ever confess to anything?
He reportedly told a cellmate that he'd hired some of the West Mesa victims, called them trashy, but no outright confession to the murders. They also found women's underwear and jewelry in his home that didn't belong to his wife or daughter.
Okay, so we've got a lot of potential suspects here, each with their own unsettling connection to the case, but no clear answers. It's like a true crime puzzle with a lot of missing pieces. Where do we even start to put it all together?
It really makes you think about the challenges of investigating crimes, especially when the victims are, well, marginalized. These women were living on the edges of society, and it's possible, even likely, that their disappearances weren't noticed as quickly or investigated as thoroughly as they might have been otherwise.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to think about their families, going years without knowing what happened to their loved ones. The article gives us a little glimpse into their lives, but each of those 11 women had a story, people who cared about them.
Absolutely. And while we can't go into every detail of their lives here, the Wikipedia article does highlight a few cases that really stand out. Like Salonia Edwards, for instance. She was only 15 years old, a runaway from Lawton, Oklahoma.
Right, she was the only African-American victim too, wasn't she?
She was.
And most of the victims were from Albuquerque, right?
That's right. So her presence among the victims is, well, it's kind of a puzzle in itself.
It makes you wonder if her being from out of state lends some weight to that sex trafficking theory. Maybe suggesting a wider network of victims being brought in from other places.
It's a good point. And then there's Michelle Valdez, who was 4 months pregnant when she died.
Oh gosh, I'd almost forgotten about that.
Yeah, it just adds another layer of horror to the whole thing, knowing that an innocent life was lost along with hers.
It's awful. And
Oh.
the fact that the case is still unsolved, I mean, that must make it even harder for the families to find any kind of peace. So where does the investigation stand now? Are there any active leads, or is this a cold case?
Well, officially it's still unsolved, but the Albuquerque Police Department, they haven't given up. They're still looking into any leads that come in, hoping to finally bring whoever did this to justice. Back in December of 2010, they even released photographs of 7 unidentified women. They believe they might be connected to the West Mesa case.
Photos of potential victims. That's chilling. Where do those photos come from?
That's part of the mystery. The police haven't said where they got them, but some of the women in the photos, they appear to be unconscious, and many of them share physical characteristics with the 11 confirmed victims. It's a disturbing detail that adds another layer of complexity to an already very complicated case.
It makes you think that the person who took those photos might be involved somehow, or at least knows something about what happened. It feels like we're getting closer to the truth, but it's still just out of reach.
Exactly. And while 2 of the women in those photos were later identified as alive, the identities of the others and their connection to the case, well, it's still a mystery.
So after years of investigation, countless hours of police work, and the unimaginable pain of the victims' families, the West Mesa murders remain this haunting puzzle. We've got multiple suspects, a chilling timeline, a possible link to sex trafficking, but no definitive answers. What are your initial thoughts on this? What stands out to you as the most compelling evidence or the most likely scenario?
It's really hard to say for sure with so many questions still unanswered. But the fact that the killings seemed to stop after Lorenzo Montoya's death, that's pretty significant. It's hard to ignore that.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? But what if he wasn't working alone? Could he have been part of a larger operation, maybe that suspected sex trafficking ring? Would that explain why the killing stopped?
It's certainly possible. The involvement of a trafficking ring could explain the methodical way the crimes were carried out, the focus on women involved in sex work, and even Salonia Edwards being in Albuquerque all the way from Oklahoma.
What about the other suspects? Do you think any of them could have been involved, even in a smaller way?
It's tough to rule anyone out completely at this point. Fred Reynolds, even though he's dead, he's still a person of interest because of his connections to prostitution and those photos of missing sex workers he supposedly had. Unfortunately, he took that information with him.
So even in death, he's still a part of this case. What about the others?
Well, Ron Irwin was cleared, but he did spend a lot of time at the state fair, which is where some of the victims might have been targeted. So it's possible he knew something, saw something that could be helpful, even now.
And what about Joseph Blee? Could he be the missing piece of this puzzle?
The DNA evidence and those circumstantial links are interesting, that's for sure. But without a confession, or more solid proof, his involvement is still just speculation. We can't definitively say he was involved, but we can't completely rule him out either.
So it seems like we're back where we started. A lot of possibilities, a lot of threads, but not enough to definitively solve this case.
That's the frustrating reality of a lot of cold cases. We may never know for sure who committed these crimes, but the search for answers goes on. Hopefully one day there will be justice for the victims and their families.
It's a case that really stays with you, you know? It's more than just a true crime mystery. It's a story about vulnerability, about the cracks in our society, and about the women who fell through them.
It shows us that we need to keep investigating and raising awareness, even for cases that have gone cold. These victims deserve justice, and their stories deserve to be remembered. We can't forget them.
You're right. By talking about these stories, by keeping them in the public eye, we honor the memory of the victims, and we remind ourselves that there's still work to do to protect the most vulnerable people in our society.
Exactly. It's not just about solving a crime, it's about understanding the bigger issues that contribute to these tragedies and working to prevent them from happening again.
Well said. And with that in mind, I think it's time to shift our focus a bit. We've talked about the suspects, the evidence, the theories, but what about the victims themselves? What about the social context that allowed this to happen? We spent a lot of time on the specifics, the suspects, the evidence, the theories. But I think there's a bigger question here we need to address. Were these women just unlucky, in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or were they targeted because they were vulnerable, because of their place in society? It's something that hangs over this whole case, and honestly, so many others like it.
Yeah, it's a question that goes beyond just this one case. It forces us to look at some hard truths about how we treat the most vulnerable people in our society. These women were already dealing with so much: poverty, addiction, lack of support. And those factors probably made them more likely to become victims in the first place, and maybe even more likely for their disappearances to go unnoticed or not be taken seriously.
They were invisible even before they disappeared, and that makes them easier targets, right?
Exactly. They were living on the margins, overlooked, judged. It's possible that made them seem like easier targets for someone who wanted to hide them. The fact that it took years for some of them to be reported missing says a lot about how they were viewed by society.
It's a stark reminder that we need to do more to protect the vulnerable people in our communities. We need to address the root causes, the poverty, the addiction, the lack of opportunity. These are the things that push people into dangerous situations.
And we need to get rid of the stigma around sex work. We need to see the humanity of the people involved and fight for their safety and well-being. Decriminalization, support services, access to health care, these are all essential to protect them.
We can't just ignore these issues.
Yeah.
This case, with all the questions and the shadows hanging over it, it forces us to look at our own communities, our own biases, the systems that fail to protect the people who need it the most.
Absolutely. It reminds us that justice isn't always guaranteed. But it also shows us the power of resilience. The families who keep searching for answers, the law enforcement officers who refuse to let these cases be forgotten, that's powerful.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the crime scene to the investigation to the bigger societal issues. What's your final takeaway from all of this?
Even with all the darkness surrounding this case, I'm struck by the continued search for justice, the people who won't let the victims be forgotten. It reminds us that we can't lose hope, that we have to keep fighting for a better world, a more just and compassionate world for everyone.
Well said. And for everyone listening, if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to dig deeper. There are tons of articles, documentaries, forums about the West Mesa murders. Do your own research, see what you think, what stands out to you, what questions do you still have.
And remember, we may never know for sure who committed these crimes, but we can honor the victims by fighting for a safer, more just world. A world where vulnerability isn't a weakness, but a call for compassion and action.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the West Mesa murders. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.